Okay, Mr. Tim,
Okay,
it's all yours.
so today we're going to finish up the 10 Commandments. We'll talk about Commandments 9 and 10. And after that, like I mentioned last week, after that, you're going to know everything you need to know about behaving relative to the 10 Commandments. So let's start with Commandment number 9. Commandment number 9 says, you must not testify falsely against your neighbor. So, question, does this commandment, where it says testify, does it relate to testify in the legal sense? What you say about somebody when you're obligated to do so? Or is it more broad than that? Does it talk about things like, does it relate to gossip, just what you say about people in general? Or is it even more broad than that and talk about just honesty in general? What do you think? What do you think the commandment says to you?
I think it's just speaking in general.
Like most of Jesus' commandments that he elaborated on in the Sermon on the Mount, he takes a very, very broad societal view,
Okay.
transcending cultures, things that doesn't matter what the culture is, we have to apply these as best we know how in the culture in which we live. So I think it has to do with our words being truthful to the best of our knowledge.
Okay. Roger has taken a very broad view. Les said very broad view. That's also the interpretation of many mainstream denominations. They take the broadest possible view of this. If you look at the Catechism of the Episcopal Church, for instance, it says this. This commandment requires us to actively speak the truth, including not misleading others by our silence in all things. In other words, we have to be truthful in everything, and there's no loophole in being truthful just by shutting up and not saying anything. Catholic doctrine teaches this commandment forbids misrepresenting the truth in all of our relations with others. So you see the word all in both of those, and many of the other denominations are very similar. The word all casts a pretty broad net. And so clearly when they look at it, they're not necessarily referencing the word testify in what we might interpret to be a legal sense, which is almost always the way we use that word today. Remember the first week we mentioned St. Augustine, and he was very influential in the evolution of Catholic theology. And the Catholic tradition is very much influenced by what he wrote on this commandment. And specifically, he wrote this as a commentary on the commandment. Under this general term, and he puts in quotation marks, you shall not bear false witness. All lying is included. For whoever declares anything orally bears witness to it in one's own mind. So in other words, St. Augustine is saying anything that goes through your head is bearing witness to what you're thinking. And so his position is that bearing false witness against one neighbor is a really, really, really broad category of actions that takes every utterance and therefore every lie being a violation of the commandments. How do you feel about that interpretation? How do you feel about the interpretation that every lie that you might speak, every mistruth that you utter is a violation of the commandment? Does it make you feel?
There's a lot of violations on the internet.
There's a lot of the internet violation central, huh? All right. So, I mean, just how do you react to that? I feel a lot of people kind of squirm and like, it's a pretty broad interpretation, isn't it?
It is, yes. And,
Well,
and there's times that we talk about white lies.
yeah, we're going to touch on that in a minute here.
Okay.
So clearly the commandment and preponderance of scripture are going to encourage us to extol honesty, right? And be truthful, be honest. That's the basis for good relationship. But is there a case to be made that the commandment might be a little more narrowly scoped than what St. Augustine said? Think about that for a minute. I'm not saying that's right or that's wrong. I just want you to think about it for a minute. We already touched on the word testify and whether we think that's legalistic or not. Let's now focus on another word in the commandment, against. The clause against your neighbor seems to imply something that might be focused on them or intentionally harmful speech or slander. Is a broad interpretation of the commandment overly harsh or mistruths that have no mouths? Let's ponder that. You know what Dora called white lie? Like, I love your new hairdo. Or I really love what you've done with the place. Or every husband's answer to, well, I look good in this dress. Man in here knows how to answer that question, and I'm not saying it's a white lie or if it's not, but not sure we're going to run afoul of the ninth commandment.
Now we get into survival.
Yes, it's survival instincts. Okay. What about falsehoods that are told for a reason? Pharaoh issued an order after the Hebrews had been enslaved. Pharaoh issued an order that said all the male Hebrew babies had to be put to death. And he told the midwives, when you deliver a Hebrew girl, it can live, and you deliver a Hebrew boy, I expect you to put it to death. But the Hebrew midwives, if you think back to the first chapter of Exodus, there's a story where the Hebrew midwives of Shiphrah and Puah lied to Pharaoh, just straight out told him to lie. When he said, how come you're not putting all these boy babies to death? They said, well, these Hebrew women aren't like the Egyptians. They're too vigorous. They're too robust. They just pop those kids out before we even show up. And they hide them, and we don't even have a chance to get there and put these babies to death. So they flat out lied, and God rewarded them for it. You guys all know the story of Rahab, who lied to the Canaanite soldiers when she hid the Hebrew spies. And she's held in extremely high regard. She even shows up in the book of Hebrews where they list all of the people who had great acts of faith. They call it, the Faith Hall of Fame in Hebrews. She's listed in that for that reason. That makes this a really interesting commandment to interpret, because an overly broad interpretation where we said, St. Augustine said, any mistruth is covered, might be a little too onerous, but a narrow interpretation might be a little too generous, at least in terms of justifying our own behavior, where that might be concerned. So finding the sweet spot on this one is really kind of a challenge. And we could go through a bunch of scripture references that say this lying is wrong, or you pull out the Rahab story and say, well, maybe situationally it might be okay. And I'm not sure digging into the details is the way to look at this one versus stepping back and stepping up, perhaps looking at this at a little higher altitude becomes more instructive, where we go back and say, wait a minute, at its essence, the 10 Commandments were directing us towards achieving positive relationships. The first 4, a positive relationship with God. The second 6, a positive relationship with each other, our family and our community. And is it wrong if we flatter someone? Is that really harmful speech? Yeah.
I think one of the things you have to consider is, what is the purpose of the lie?
Okay, what is the purpose of the lie?
If it's to do good, is it really all that bad?
Okay.
If it's to do evil, to slander or put down, then yes, we all can agree that that's one of the baddies.
What is the motivation? What is the outcome? We're going to have a chance to look at those different angles here in a minute. But I think what God is directing us to when we think about this in terms of relationships, what are the things that tear down either our community or our faith? And where do mistruths, can't say that word, where do lies, it's a lot easier, creep into that? As I researched this, I came across another aspect of opinion. I don't know that I subscribe to it, but I came across more than a fair number of opinions. I'll call them the stick and stone school of commentary. that basically said all these opinions were built around the premise that these are just words. Certainly, they don't rise to the level of killing somebody, taking something, or taking someone's mate, if you will. And when you look at adultery, when you look at stealing, when you look at violence and murder, that somehow this commandment couldn't be quite as important as the others, because we're just talking about words here. Sticks and stones will hurt my bones, but words will never hurt me. I don't know that I believe that. Certainly, God put it on the list for a reason. And that's when I started to think about, why is this one down here? If you believe to that theory, you say, well, if it wasn't as important, why would he mention it? But he did. Why do you think God is telling us what we say about somebody else is important? If I level all the other 9 things we see in the 10 Commandments.
Doesn't it have to do with relationship?
Well, certainly relationships is part of it. Les, you had your hand up.
I think it starts to plant the seed to go into the other one. To
Can you move it for a little bit?
create bad relationships with people, mistrust, everything else that starts directing some of the other issues.
Okay, starts to plant the seed. And I thought, certainly
I need to
God
move
wanted
it.
to get along. God wanted to be supportive.
No, it's fine. Thank you.
But was that really what was there? Was that what was driving it? And as I pondered that, I probably has a lot to do with what pops into my mind. But one of the things that pops into my mind, I thought back to the Westminster Catechism. We've mentioned that in here before. If you don't think you know it, you actually do, because you've heard it before. But it's the catechism that goes back almost into the 1500s, where they tried to define the attributes of God. That's where we come up with the omniscient, omnipresent descriptors of God is out of that catechism, all powerful, all knowing, all present. When you look at that list of attributes of God, one of the things that's also listed there is God is all just. And God is certainly merciful. God certainly offers grace, and that's to our great advantage. But at the end of the day, God demands justice, and God ensures justice. So there's going to be some judgment. There's going to be an accounting. And when I thought about testify, and again, I think this is broader than the legal sense, but when you look at what you say about someone, whether it's legalistically or just in general, that skews opinions, it skews thoughts, it forms the basis of people's actions, and false testimony corrupts justice. And if God is all just, corrupted justice is going to be an abomination to him. Not only that, it destroys community. God is after all here starting a nation. And a nation is not going to work as a collection of individuals. Even if every one of those individuals believe in him as God, if all they're going to do is act in their own interest, it's going to fall apart. So you've got to build the community on relationships. The community builds the nation that he's trying to create. And at the end of the day, justice is one of the pillars of that community they're going to have to be able to count on. And that's going to rely on honesty and truth. It kind of jumped into my head. That justice relies on honesty and truth, not legality. So the people have to trust each other.
There's another here.
What they hear from one another is honest, or nothing sticks together. So God's sought to protect the community, create a community. And we see that in all of these commandments. The community can be harmed by our actions, murder and stealing. The community can be harmed by our inaction, failure to honor our parents and take care of our obligations to children. The community can be harmed by our urges. We saw that as it relates to adultery, and we'll talk about that next as it relates to coveting. And the community can be harmed by our words. And so I think that's why God cared a great deal. I'm sure everyone in here has heard either their mother or father or a teacher or someone as an adult when they were young say this, and you could recite it with me. If you can't say something nice about someone, what? Don't say anything at all. Do you think this commandment has something to do with that maxim? The commandment doesn't require us to say nice stuff. The commandment requires us to say truthful stuff. You see the essence of that in there? Last week, Roger made a really interesting comment relating to stealing that said, we're not just talking about stuff. Particularly in this day and age, intellectual property comes into play. If I take credit for something greater than my contribution to whatever that something is, I've in fact stolen someone else's achievement. So let me ask you a question from that perspective as it relates to this commandment. Does the phrase against your neighbor in this commandment limit the scope of this commandment to only negative comments about someone else? Or are positive comments about me as offensive as negative comments about you if they're equally inaccurate? What do you think?
Did you make that up yourself?
What's that?
Did you make that one up yourself?
Well, here you go. We don't necessarily associate the 9th commandment with the action of puffing ourselves up, right? But I challenge you to think about that for a minute. Just as wrong to lie in a positive way about me as a negative way about somebody else. Especially when the outcome of that lie in many, many cases is the purpose of that is to reflect, at least in a comparative sense, less on someone else. Well, I'm not going to say anything bad about them, but I know I'm better than, or I can do this better than. We've gotten so good at it, we even have a word for it. In this day and age, it's called resume padding. Because, well, lying sounds so negative. Right? I suspect no one in here has ever heard of a lady by the name of Mary Lee Jones. She spent 28 years at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. When you're talking about blue blood academic institutions in this country, MIT is as blue as it gets. She rose to the level of Dean of Admissions. And if you've ever worked in or around a university, you know that being a dean is a big deal. And she was a big deal. She essentially wasn't the only person, but at the end of the day, she was the person that stamped who got in and who didn't until 2007. When it was learned that she not only didn't have the master's degree she claimed to have, she didn't have a college degree of any kind. As a dean of MIT. But that's what her resume said. George O'Leary is a name you might recognize, particularly if you're a football fan. If you're a college football fan, you would recognize George O'Leary because in 2001, he left the head coaching position at Georgia Tech University and became the head coach of Notre Dame for 5 days. Until it was learned that the master's degree he claimed to have from NYU, in addition to 3 years playing experience he claimed to have from the University of New Hampshire, did not exist. More recently, I don't know where you got, what your favorite news outlet is and where you like to get your news, but we could probably all remember the NBC newsman, Brian Williams, who they got to sit on the sidelines for 6 months. They kicked him off the air for 6 months because he lied. Well, he embellished a story. He padded a story about his exploits in Iraq and getting on And it helps. Let's assume that these were God-fearing people. Let's just make that assumption. I don't know what their faith is, but let's just assume these were God-fearing people. And if you went to them and asked them straight up and said, why would you so blatantly disregard and violate the 9th commandment? What do you think their reaction to that would be?
Oh,
What?
what's that?
What are you talking about? I didn't say anything bad about anybody. There was someone who was in the running for dean of admissions at MIT who might have had the academic background to carry that job and didn't get it. There was ultimately somebody that took George O'Leary's spot at Notre Dame, much to their regret when you look at who those people were until Brian Kelly showed up. But still, I'm sure Notre Dame regretted that whole 5-day episode. In retrospect, I'm sure Brian Williams regretted that whole episode of puffing up his achievements, if you want to call it that, for the purpose of, well, people want to listen to me, so they won't listen to them. I mean, you can spin this in a way that you see some negative aspects about other people, even when I'm just focusing on myself. So I challenge you to think about the commandment that way. You can decide whether it applies that way or not, but I thought it was an interesting way to interpret it. Because even when you say to yourself, I don't like to gossip about people, I'm not going to say negative stuff. I'm only say positive things.
Are you here?
It's positive about yourself.
It's a psalm of
What about
integrity.
Jesus in the 9th commandment?
They gave the
I think we're almost.
second verse.
I think it's pretty simple. You can probably summarize Jesus in the 9th commandment with one brief comment, backed up by a ministry of demonstration. The brief comment I would point you to is out of the book of Matthew, and I'll read it to you. You'll recognize it. It says, do unto others whatever you would like them to do unto you. This is the essence of all that is taught in the law and the prophets. Now, you guys undoubtedly recognize that as the golden rule, right? That's the golden rule. Do unto others. I got to believe the do encompasses the word say. You want people speaking bad things about you. You want people issuing lies about you. Don't do it about other people. Stick with the truth. You can't go too far wrong. Well, that's a very brief comment. Now let's look at the examples. False testimony, lies, gossip, all have one purpose. At the end of the day, they all have one purpose, and that's to tear somebody else down. Yeah, so I'm either tearing them down, or I'm puffing myself up, or I'm doing both. What Christ taught by example was the opposite of tearing people down. It was also the opposite of building himself up. When you look at the opposite of tearing somebody else down is elevating, lifting them up, supporting them. Like he did with the woman that was accused of adultery that we talked about last week. People were ready to stone her, and he lifted her up, essentially saved her from that situation, and hopefully put her on a better path. Same story with the woman he encounters at the well. The same story with the woman that anointed him with oil, that everybody was ready to jump on her, and he stepped in. We could spend the rest of our time here today citing examples of Christ building people up. That was his very nature. And when you look at the opposite of building up yourself, well, it's humility. And Christ is the essence of humility. If you were to look at the key points of this commandment, which to me, the key points of this commandment and the essence of Jesus' ministry are remarkably similar. Be humble, speak the truth, be supportive of others. Don't speak falsely about other people. Means I'm going to be humble about myself, to not try and reflect you in a bad light. I'm going to speak the truth, so I'm not telling lies about you. And the process of doing those two things, I'm trying to be supportive. Christ did the exact same thing. And I don't think that is a coincidence. Let's talk about Commandment 10 for a minute, now that we're halfway home. Commandment 10, you must not covet your neighbor's house. You must not covet your neighbor's wife, male or female servant, ox or donkey, or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. That pretty much covers waterfront, doesn't it? If you remember all the way back to week 1, we talked about denominational differences in the 10 Commandments. This is one of those differences. This commandment that I just read is the way it is written in Exodus, and this is the commandment. This is the 10th commandment for the Hebrews and most Protestant denominations. Roman Catholics and Lutherans take the 10th commandment and split it into 9 and 10. They have an earlier commandment that is consolidated, which left them one short, so they split this one. That follows the way the commandments are referenced in Deuteronomy when Moses reiterated them. But for the Roman Catholic and Lutheran tradition, the 9th commandment is, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. And the 10th commandment is, don't covet everything else. So they split that in 2. But for us, being the majority of Protestantism and Methodism, all of that is the 10th commandment. So what is coveting? What does it mean to covet something? Desire, want. What else? Covet something. Because I think desire and want is in there, but I'm not sure that quite gets to it. Does anybody else have any thoughts on covet?
Maybe it has to do with desiring something for which you're not entitled.
Okay, something that you're not entitled. So it's not mine. I don't deserve it or owe it or earned it, but I want it.
Maybe it's not only wanting it, desiring it, that's going to like commit, I'm gonna get it.
Okay, it has some level of commitment or some implied action there.
I think there's some jealousy involved.
Okay, some jealousy involved. Those are all good. When I looked this up, the best succinct summary of covet that I found was this: to desire inordinately, meaning beyond reasonable limits, something that belongs to another. So you certainly have the desire and the want. And you have Roger's aspect of, well, it's not mine, it belongs to another. But the important piece of this, I think, they stuck in the middle, and that reflects an intensity of the desire, inordinately, beyond reasonable limit. I really want this so bad, I have to have it. That's where.
Think of David and the extent that he went to get the sheep.
Exactly. We're going to mention him in a minute. Think of David. It's a feeling, it's an urge, it's a desire, and lust and greed, we've talked about that, are desires that we talked about, and in that sense, it's like them, but it's also a little different. It's a specific desire. If I look at greed, greed is a general desire to just accumulate wealth. Lust is a general desire to accumulate attention and affection. Coveting is a specific desire about something of someone else's. I want his house. I want her car. I want that person's mate. It's targeted. Yeah, I want that. So it gets to be very personal.
Wonder why the commandment says thy neighbor's goods, instead of all people's.
Well, that gets back to the biblical question. Who is your neighbor?
Everyone.
So when you start to define community, your neighbor's not the person that's on this side and in the back. The neighbor's everybody we got here.
Funny word to use for that.
True. Now, what's interesting about this commandment, if you think back to what we've been looking at in the words and actions of Jesus with respect to most of the other commandments, we saw that he redirected the focus of the commandment from act to urge, from act to motivation. Do not murder. Don't get angry. Don't commit adultery. Push lust out of your heart. Do not steal. Live generously and without greed. You know, he's taking these actions defined in the commandment and pushing them towards the motivations that would result in the act, but get us to a higher level of thought and consciousness on being aware of our behavior, I think. But this particular commandment is actually given in that same context that Christ kind of took the others to. This commandment is given in context of our urges, our motivations. It goes beyond an act. We already talked about adultery, coveting your neighbor's mate. We already talked about stealing, coveting your neighbor's stuff. So this kind of takes us in another step towards where we've seen Christ on these other commandments already, where we talk about urges that if we act on them are going to break down community, they're going to break down relationships, they're going to cause us to do things that we are going to regret. What is the urge that spurs us to covet? We mentioned jealousy. I think jealousy is close. What is the urge that spurs us to covet? And think back to one of the other, we've talked about the 7 deadly sins. It's in there. Envy. Envy. I want your stuff more than your stuff. I like what you got better than what I got. I like who you're with better than who I'm with. And Nep, if you're on, I didn't mean that.
Kim?
What? Phyllis, yes.
Yeah, if I'm spending so much time looking at what you got, wanting it, then I'm not spending very much of my time being grateful for what I have.
Exactly.
And I think this speaks to the sin of ingratitude.
Exactly. We're going to touch on that in a little bit. That's keep that thought. But I think you're dead on accurate. Let me ask this question. Has anybody seen any commercials lately that said, you know, you're fine the way you are. You already have enough stuff in you are good.
Do not buy this stuff.
Yeah. Do not buy this. Has anybody seen any of those? Our entire consumer-oriented world revolves around the concept of denying enough. Whatever you have, it's not new enough, cool enough, small enough, big enough, fast enough. It's not whatever it is. There's a marketing campaign around telling you that whatever you got doesn't have enough of it. We used to get ads. I'm kind of like bombarded with ads the way World War II carpet bombing, right? We send enough bombers with enough bombs over this whole general area and drop them. Some of them are going to hit the target. And that's kind of the way ads used to be. If we put enough ads on enough different media at enough targets being potential buyers, we're going to sell stuff. But we live in the age of smart bombs. And if you said, what does smart bombs have to do with ads and coveting? I'll ask you this question. How many of you have had a conversation about something? Good, service, some commodity, I don't care what it is. But you've had a conversation with someone, your mate, a friend, and the next day, or even maybe later on that afternoon, you open up your phone and, wait a minute, I was just talking about that. And there's one advertised right there. We live in an age where ads are algorithmically targeted at wanting you to covet things. Doesn't matter if you don't have Nest. or Alexa or any other of those personal assistance devices at your house. If you own a smartphone, you have a listening device and it's taking in what you say and it's going to feed you a stream of stuff you might want. Specifically targeted to things you talk about and things you might want so that you'll covet things and buy them. Which brings up a couple of questions. One is, companies do this because it works. I wouldn't spend money on that if we didn't act that way. Would it work if we lived by the 10th commandment? If Phyllis's thought about the sin of ingratitude popped into our heads, wait a minute, I don't need that. Would it work if we lived by the 10th commandment? Covet, a desire beyond reasonable limits. Here's some sobering information. As of 2021, there are almost 506 million credit card accounts in the United States. And there are 262 million adults in this country, and I did the math because I can do that now. It turns out to 2. But I said, that's not too bad. That's just 2 cards per person, 4 cards per couple. And then I went on to read the rest of the data. Those accounts have amassed 806 billion with a B in credit card debt. 806 billion. The median balance on a credit on those 506 million credit card accounts, and the median is not an average. The median is where half of the population is above that number and half of the population is below that number. So it's arithmetically in the middle, but not the average. But the median is $2,700. So that means the median individual in the United States, the median adult, has a little over $5,000 in credit card debt, and the median couple has $11,000 in credit card debt. What other than a desire beyond reasonable limits is going to get somebody to pay 16%, which is the average credit card interest rate, on $11,000? So you don't have to do the math, I've done it. That's $498 in interest charges a month. A month. So that takes you to question 2. Like we observed when Jesus said, don't get mad. Well, that's easy to say, but how do you do it? Don't covet. How do we not covet? Yes, Dora.
Be content with what you have.
Be content with what you have. You know, that is a perfect segue. Let me tell you this little story. She's good. Some of you may have heard of the organization called Marriage Encounter. If you haven't, as you might suspect, Marriage Encounter is focused on helping couples grow and strengthen their relationship. So even if you've heard of Marriage Encounter, I doubt that you've ever heard of John and Ann Batar. John and Ann Batar, back in 2013, were identified, recognized by Marriage Encounter as winners of their longest marriage contest. Now, that was not certified by, whoever does the world records. That's just who they chose in their contest. In late 2017, shortly before John's death, in early 18, he and Ann celebrated their 85th wedding anniversary. So at the time they were recognized, they had been married 81 years. And of course, they had some recognition, and one of the things they did to recognize them, they did an interview. And in the interview, they were asked what it took to achieve the kind of longevity they had in their relationship. And they said 2 things. And when you think about it, they essentially said the same thing 2 ways. They said you have to live within your means, and be content with what you have. They basically said you live by the 10th commandment. Living within your means I'm not coveting something beyond reasonable limits that I get myself into financially. Being content with what I have, as Phyllis indicated, means I'm living with a sense of gratitude that I don't need more. You know, we've been talking about our world for this one. Other commandments we kind of talked about the Hebrews. I've spent a lot of time talking about our time on this one. But there wasn't targeted advertising in the desert. There wasn't even a whole lot of stuff probably to buy. Maybe that's why you didn't want to covet their stuff, because you couldn't go buy any of your own. Everything that was there belonged to somebody else. But God warned us about coveting at that point nonetheless. If you put two toddlers in the same room, give each of them a toy, it's minutes, if not seconds, before one of them walks over to the other one, yells mine, and grabs it. What is it about our nature that has us focus more on what we don't have than what we do?
Go back to the very beginning.
Go back to the beginning.
Go back to Eve and the serpent. You know, Adam saying, yeah, okay, you know, we can be more like God. Not content. You know, it's already the very beginning. I see it, you know, balance
It's like wired, right? Part of our DNA. It's like, okay, there's your color of your eyes, and there's the color of your hair, and there's the fact you're going to want stuff.
There's another point. It's kind of obvious. Maybe that you don't covet so much that you just don't want that person to have it.
Okay. It's like, I don't want it, but I want them to have it either. That's the Bear Bryant School of Recruiting. I'm not going to play that kid, but I don't want him to go to Tennessee. I hear you. I can't think of a single coveting story in the Bible that doesn't turn out badly. And when you want to talk about, talk about human nature, we go all the way back to the beginning. Adam and Eve coveted the apple, turned out bad. Cain coveted God's blessing of Abel's offering, and that didn't go very well. David coveted Bathsheba, and that went bad. Really went bad for Uriah, but it also went bad for David and Bathsheba and their firstborn. Ahab and Jezebel coveted Naboth's vineyard, and that turned out badly for all the people involved. And it wasn't just the Old Testament. Christ gave us the parable of the vineyard workers. Remember the unhappy tenants? That the owner moved away, but the people worked his vineyard, and when he sent people back to get his share, they beat him up, then they started killing him. He sent his son, they killed him too. Because they coveted what was due him. And it goes on. It wasn't just Christ in the New Testament. You guys remember the story of Ananias and Sapphira, right? They coveted the recognition that was given to people that were supporting the early church. And it didn't turn out good for them either. In every one of those instances, death was a consequence of someone involved, and in some cases, several involved. Coveting affects relationships, and it affects individuals. The relationship doesn't always break down because my neighbor gets mad because I want his stuff. Sometimes it changes me. Many times it changes me. But I would tell you all the time it changes me. So what do we learn about coveting from Jesus? Well, he certainly echoed the same cautions that the commandment echoed. An example is this statement out of Luke where he says, beware, guard against every kind of covetousness. Life is not measured by how much you own. But more importantly than what he said, you go back and you look at Christ's actions, and his teachings are the very antidote for coveting. And I want to list 4 things that I think stood out in Christ's examples and behavior. And the first one I'm going to talk about, Phyllis mentioned, that's gratitude. Second one is compassion. Third one is generosity. And the fourth is service. I think those are the 4 antidotes to coveting. Being grateful for what you have makes it easier to not feel like you're owed more. I'm already so happy with what I have. I don't need more. I don't deserve more. I'm not owed more. Focusing on the needs of others, which is compassion, enables me to see the sufficiency of my own situation. And then once I've seen and once I've focused it on the needs of others, actually taking action on those needs, which is service, particularly when I take action using my own resources, which is generosity, allows me to not only not covet, but release what God has given me in help and support of someone else, perhaps even willingly. Sometimes I think God's okay with compliance at the beginning. We'll get you happy later. Yeah, just do it, and trust me on this one, you'll learn to like it later. It was kind of like what my mom told me about eating broccoli. Just eat it, you'll learn to like it later. Now I eat a lot of broccoli. All of these things break down coveting and build up relationships and community. To wrap up, I would make this last observation, that I think the commandments have really interesting bookends. And I think the 10th commandment brackets the first commandment. Because the first commandment, which told us, and remember, hopefully I forgot about this in just 5 weeks. The first commandment that says you'll have no other gods before me talks about our attention and priority for God. And the 10th commandment draws our attention to all the things that take our attention and priority away from God and compete for it, and all the other gods that we chase instead. People, stuff, things that turn our attention. And then when you realize that, you recognize that the 10th commandment comes with a double whammy attached to it. Because I told you, it breaks down relationships. Because it changes me and it changes my neighbor's view of me, but that's not all it does. Because left unchecked, coveting will not only change my relationship with my neighbor, it'll change my relationship with God. Because all of a sudden, a whole bunch of other stuff is now in the way of the first commandment. And so all of the relationships have been damaged and changed. So I think there's a reason. When I asked people before, last week or the week before, are the 10 commandments in priority order? I know it's easy to look at them that way, but I would say I don't think they are, because I think the first and the last bracket one another and kind of sandwich what's in the middle. Comments and questions about the 10 commandments. You now know everything you need to know.
Coveting commandments, there is one thing that you mentioned, vanity.
Vanity, yeah.
Comes into play.
Yeah.
Well, particularly about lying about yourself.
Yeah, lying about myself. Yeah, certainly there's no self-absorption in today's culture, right? Les.
I think coveting, I think of the dangers of comparing yourself to other people, and that to me, that's always been a no-win situation where when you compare yourself that you have to other people, either someone else has more than you want it, or someone else has less than you figure you're better than they are.
Right.
And so just, it touches on everything we've been talking about, to realize God made you who you are. You're blessed, you made like that here to value what he's done for you, and basically appreciate what you've been given.
Absolutely. Appreciate what you've been given. Don't focus on other blessings or relations.
I can see what's happening.
Any other thoughts or comments?
Yeah, this is Roger. You know, thinking about the Ten Commandments and some of the questions we've asked and you've asked us to consider. If someone wants to denigrate or challenge the legitimacy of the Ten Commandments, it's easy to do. Because if you say, well, honor your father and mother, or what, you get into the but what about this? But what about the father who's abusive? Thou shalt not kill, but what about the wars? And so it's very easy if you are a doubter to challenge the legitimacy. Now, on the other end of the spectrum is the legalistic view where you want to limit. You agree that they are legitimate, but you want to limit the application of them, as we talked about earlier today. And so, you know, you can attack these in two different ways. One is to, but what about? And then the secondly, well, surely that does not imply that.
Good.
Tim, I'd like to say something.
Yes, absolutely. We'd love to hear it.
Something I think from just looking into what Jesus, when he refers to these commandments, and then just from all of us, I think in here who are all white or bald, or some of us are white and bald, I think our experience reminds us that commandments are of little value to unbelievers for the same main reason that Roger mentioned. But the Ten Commandments were given to God's people for two reasons, it seems to me, and it's good for us to keep it in mind. One, it's if you want to have a good community, if you want to have a good family, or if you want to have a good life, here are some things that will help you, some guidelines. These are not for people who don't want it, because they're of no value. You can argue them all away very easily intellectually. Secondly, I think they're given to say that if you don't believe them and you don't want them, okay, but we're going to see that you don't hurt the rest of us, because the community is more important than you. The last thing I mentioned, I think the commandments for me is kind of like, I think the way Jesus used them is to say, Bill, what is it about this commandment that can help you and help your family, help your relationship? And so I'm looking at it not so much from fear of loss, not so much for hope of gain, but mainly I'm doing it because of gratitude. I think that's what Moses has said, and that's what Jesus said. Why are you going to do these things? It's because of what you just got out of Egypt, folks, and how grateful are you? And I just think of it, I want to do these things because Jesus died for me. And I think the rest of us, we should not expect lost people, should not expect the non-Christian to want to do these things. I think it's our job to look at them and to help show them as opportunities, not as restrictions. And I just think that's a very important thing. It's so hard. I hear Christians say, well, why don't they do what's right? And you think, well, what is wrong with your brain? Jesus told us that unless you're born of the Spirit, unless you're filled with gratitude for what God, you are not going to do them. You don't even want to do them. So we have a broken system. The DNA has a dilemma in it, and so that's just something I think we all need to keep in mind.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions?
Oh, I did want to say this one other thing. I remember C.S. Lewis said it, and it's always been a help for me. These commandments are spiritual laws. And spiritual laws given by God are just like physical laws. And that is, you can't break them, they break you. You may not believe in gravity, but go ahead and jump. But if you believe in it, it can help you, keep you from being hurt. And I think it's a very simple model for us to look at Are there any of these commandments that are designed to hurt us? No. So I think that's a very important principle that Lewis lifted up, helped a lot of people.
Really like that observation. You don't break them, they break you. I like
Tim, I appreciate your wrap up of the 4 points, and the one about service really jumps out to me. And I think, you know, with our new senior pastor, her thinking about missions and service, you know, I'm hoping, you know, revives a larger group of people. I'm speaking to the choir here. I mean, you know, every other Wednesday, I have a very small part in doing some manual labor in a Open Hearts ministry that Vicky and Les started, and it's not Open Hearts. See how involved I am? You know, but the point is,
From what I saw this morning, you're just a pretty face. Though.
yeah. Well, now you're lying. You know, but you go and you serve, and it's impossible to not be grateful, in my opinion, for what you have by spending 2 hours, you know, doing something that's simply a little bit of a labor, you know, and all you people in here are involved in various things that are focused on the screen, you know, but the service that we're called to me, is, you know, because it focuses you back,
Right.
in my opinion, you know. I'm excited the direction our church, I think, more so than you know, than we have perhaps in the past.
Creates the right perspective.
You know, it's always been real sobering to me about that. Is go to an estate sale.
Okay.
Old house.
That's
I always come out just like, I want to go burn it. Oh my gosh.
A lot of stuff, huh?
Yeah.
It was kind of a joke in Dallas that one of the most popular stores there is the Container Store.
Container
There's
store.
so much stuff, they have to go buy stuff to put their stuff in.
Well, all you have to do is look at all this, the used storage places around town. There's an entire business model in selling Americans extra space for their stuff.
Including your wines.
Yeah. Now that I don't want to get too far away from. Okay, well, for the last time, I will close with this prayer. Lord, help me not only to know your commandments, but to live them. Help me to have no other gods before you. Help me that I might not worship anything but you. Help me to hallow your name and not profane it. May I be still, listen, and rest with you on the Sabbath. Make me a blessing to my parents and make me worthy of being blessed by my children. Help me to not take what isn't mine or to speak falsely of others, and teach me to be content with what you have given me. Lord, help me to love you with all of my heart, soul, mind, and strength, to love my neighbor as myself, fulfilling me your promise that you would inscribe your commandments on my heart. I pray all these things in Christ's name. Amen.
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 I guess in closing, oh, go ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, you're just waving, okay.
I'd just like to thank
how to get off.
for teaching this class. Because for me, when you think about a class on the 10 Commandments, you're thinking, man, this is gonna be a dry course.
Yes,
What are you
Susan.
gonna teach on the 10 Commandments? You did a great job, and I just really appreciate all the effort you put into it.
Amen.
See us.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye now.
Let's let some other people in first, because I don't know. It's just gonna that record. Well, let's look under here.
Leave right there.
Guess that's one way to shut it down. Yeah, it looks like everything shut down.
It was effective.
Yeah. We had a little rough start this morning getting going, but it turned out okay, right on time. Anybody have anything they'd like to add this morning? I'll be sending out, you probably saw an email, and I'll be sending out another one about, the money we have in our account. We got $1,800 in our account. So, if you see something that you think would be appropriate to bring to the class and talk about should we contribute or do something, feel free to do that. I know Vicki was stopped this morning by Rebecca Sweet, and she mentioned that the youth are trying to raise enough money to do a bunk bed project, and they need $400, and they figure the youth can raise $200. And so they're asking would Voyagers be willing to donate the $200 to
Match their 200. I moved. Donate 200.
Second it.
all in favor?
Aye.
That,
The other thing is Wanda Robinson contacted me and they are having a youth meeting in the Family Life Center on Sunday evenings. And so she's approaching all of the Sunday school classes in the spring, in the fall, and in the spring. And she's given us some ideas.
Smartphone connected.
It's like 5:30 to 6. And if we want to stay and visit with the kids, we can, but we're just looking for it. We want to do that, and we'll have to have somebody that's going to take the lead in that. So just be thinking about that. If that's something we want to do, but they're approaching all the Sunday school classes. So.
Disconnected. Smartphone connected.
smartphone enjoyed your class so much this morning, they want to stop.
Disconnected. Smartphone connected. Disconnected.
Now we get it.
Back to the remainder of this, I used the suite.
You'll have a good week. Hey, Ralph.
Yeah. 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 That's pretty much. That was pretty much.
Yeah.
Come to find out, I don't know that mine's so much on fire.
That was better now.
Everything I do on my phone, my phone basically is everything. Go here, stay here. You know what stuff I'm getting?
And he does not vote to,
No, if I tell you what, if I had a long to go, I'd have to sit down and for some reason. So what? I love going to like. But I think Randy.
So next Sunday.
So,
Yeah. Yeah, I had to.
well, it's early service. Why not? So next week, I'll make sure. We'll realize. Right, right.
Set it up on top.
Set it up on the camera, right? The camera itself is already up top. The mic does that. Yeah, I didn't know where to go. And so he already has a laptop set up. We're already basically set up. We just want to start.
Yeah.
I saw that about right. So, that's what this brings me to that ask you. So, that they will take this. So once somebody has that number, they save it in their phone or whatever, they don't need a link, you don't need anything. Assuming they have a Zoom on the computer. Which is my wife. Yes, link that's easier for you. If we haven't set up like the type of number, man, you're gonna be. Yeah, 18 months, a year and a half, yeah, whatever, yeah.
Going there.
Yeah, some people don't, they're gonna put it, they're gonna load some on their system to get to the link. Yes, that's exactly right. So, okay, I'll be next week for sure, no problem. So y'all gonna be gone most of the month of September? Yeah, yeah.
She smells.
They take your food.
Steps. Raise your head up. Place it underneath.
You can't get out. Okay, that's what I'm thinking. How you gonna get back?
Everything.
Man, on the really. It's way too close.
My wife wants to see what you do with it. The perfect day for my wife. With her cat shrimps. Sitting on the sofa or Just join. Okay, you know, you can sit there, and watch the ocean go by, we all day, and do nothing. So that's what you want to do, you know. And so I've been thinking about rivers, but here in the States. I go up north. I just am coming south, fly up. Michigan or wherever, it comes out, you know, to go, you know, and stuff. You know. Yeah, yeah. That's always our child. We're in Colorado. I'm like, we're going on vacation. I like to go. Let's go. You know, that's all I can go over Colorado. Okay, so I'm like, okay, sleep late, we're going to do something about the noon. Okay, yeah. We're on to go for the rest of the night. Early, I'm like, let's get up, let's go start doing things, let's go see stuff. And then she's like, do we have to script everything we do? Yeah. I'm like, yeah, we got next thing. Yeah, that's my life. Yeah, so, well, good, that's exciting. All right, I'll see you. I'll be here. Good business.
Yeah, this one. He get in his truck. He wait for some of these girls. Went back there and go out on dates. Follow it out there. Keep them safe. Just that. It made a hand out of each one. But. And then I never saw them. There you go. So, retry. They didn't run that.
I know what you mean, yeah, actually, that's what. But actually.
It'll rain. Oh, yeah.
50% today, 40 tomorrow.
That's what you want to go for, right?
That's it.
At least he's on the next.
Okay.
See you.
Uh-huh.
Not sure. It'll depend on whether it comes on the ball.
Friday, yeah, actually, maybe fine. But cook about the ranch, yeah.
Good that.
Well, now we can go, but now it's different.